My name is Clara Renfield. I'm 33 years old, and the morning my mother accused me of neglecting my elderly father, I was standing barefoot in my own kitchen, looking at a sheriff's deputy who had no idea my family had been living off my receipts for 6 years. It was a Sunday. I remember that because the coffee was still hot, the church bells from Street Marks were just starting across town, and I had a stack of Medicare claims open on my laptop that I'd promised myself I would not touch until Monday. 3 knocks came at the door. Not loud, not angry, just official enough to make my stomach tighten before I even turned the handle. The deputy asked if I was Clara Renfield. Then he looked down at his clipboard and said a complaint had been filed. My mother, Marlene, claimed I was withholding shared family property and refusing safe housing to my father after his heart surgery. Shared family property. That was what she called my lake house. 2 months earlier, my parents had signed their house over to my younger sister Haley after her baby's baptism. Nobody called me, nobody warned me. I found out through a county transfer notice because for 6 years, I had been the one paying the taxes, the insurance, the roof repair, and the medical lien that kept that house from disappearing. They gave Haley the house I saved. Then they asked for the only house I owned. When I said no, my mother did not cry. She did not yell. She smiled like a woman who had already decided which version of the story would reach the world first. And the next morning, the law was standing on my porch. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 31% right now, right? If that's true, type 6. If not, type 9. Let's see whether I got it right. All right. Enough talking. Let's begin the story. I stepped aside and let Deputy Kells in because years of auditing medical bills had taught me one thing. When someone comes to your door with an accusation, panic only makes the accusation louder. He wiped his boots on the mat, even though they were dry. And that small politeness steadied me more than it should have. I pointed him toward the kitchen table, where my laptop was still open beside a half-finished claim review and a yellow legal pad covered in billing codes no one in my family had ever cared to understand. "Give me 90 seconds, I said. He nodded, and I walked to the file cabinet in my office without rushing. That mattered. Guilty people rush. Frightened people over-explain. I had spent too many years sitting across from clinic owners and office managers who were terrified of being audited, telling them the same thing every time the numbers looked ugly. The truth is usually boring. The truth has paper. I came back with a slim blue folder and laid the documents on the table, one at a time. The deed first, then the closing statement, then the county tax record for Hollow Pine Lake, then the insurance policy with my name printed cleanly across the top. Clara May Renfield, one owner, no cosigner, no family trust, no shared title hiding in the margins. Just me. Deputy Kells leaned over the deed and read quietly. His face did not change much, but his shoulders did. The stiffness left them first. Then his pen stopped moving. "This property is only in your name?" he asked. "Only mine," I said. "Always." He looked toward the window. Maybe because people in his job learn not to react too quickly. Outside, the maple tree by my driveway was dropping leaves onto his cruiser. Inside, my kitchen was so still I could hear the refrigerator click on. I told him my parents had stayed at the lake house a few weekends in the summer. Guests? Nothing more. They had never paid a mortgage payment, a tax bill, an insurance premium, or even a repair invoice on that house. They had been invited, and then they had confused invitation with ownership. He listened without interrupting. That was when I opened the second folder. Not all of it. Not yet. Just enough. County tax receipts from my parents' house. Insurance reinstatement. A roof repair invoice. The first page of the reimbursement ledger, signed by Leonard and Marlene Renfield in blue ink. Deputy Kells read my mother's signature, longer than he read my father's. "This is about another property?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "The house they gave my sister." He set the clipboard down. There is a particular silence that happens when a story starts losing its shape. I watched him find it. My mother had sent him to my door, carrying a version of me that could not survive contact with county records. Still, I knew Marlene Renfield. One failed complaint would not stop her. My mother had never needed the truth to win. She only needed to tell her story first, loudly enough, and in front of the right people. And that was exactly what she was already planning. But to understand why she thought she could take my house with a story, I have to take you back to the night my father called me from a hospital parking lot in 2019. It was November 2019. Cold enough that the parking lot lights outside Mercy General looked blurred through the frost on my windshield. My father called at 9:17 p.m. I remember the time because I had just finished correcting a denied cardiology claim and was staring at the word resubmitted when his name lit up my phone. Leonard Renfield did not call late. He believed problems got smaller if you waited until morning to name them. So, when I answered and heard traffic behind him, then his breathing, then nothing for 3 full seconds, I closed my laptop. "Clara," he said, "there's a letter from the county." That was all. Not "help me," not "I'm scared." Just a letter from the county, like if he kept the sentence small enough, the damage inside it would stay small too. He was sitting in his car outside the hospital because he didn't want my mother to hear him call me. He had been discharged 2 weeks earlier after his heart surgery, still walking like every step had to be negotiated with his ribs. And somehow, in the middle of all that, the house had started slipping away. I drove over that night. Their kitchen smelled like old coffee, and the lemon cleaner my mother used when she wanted a room to look calmer than it was. Marlene sat at the table in her robe, lips pressed thin, already angry that my father had involved me. "It's not as dramatic as he made it sound," she said. I opened the letter. It was exactly that dramatic. Delinquent property taxes, insurance cancellation warning, a roofing company balance from a repair I didn't know had happened, utility arrears. A small medical lien had been attached to the house, after one outpatient bill sat unpaid long enough to grow teeth. I took out a pen because that is what practical daughters do when they are trying not to fall apart. They make columns, they add numbers. They turn fear into something with margins. $11,800 in taxes. $7,460 to reinstate the insurance. $19,300 left on the roof. Smaller balances scattered underneath, like broken glass. By the time I finished the first total, my mother had stopped talking. "Clara," she said finally, "don't turn this into one of your little audits. Families don't invoice each other." I looked at my father. He was staring at his hands. "I'm not invoicing you," I said. "I'm keeping this clean." The first reimbursement ledger was 1 page. Plain language, date, amount, purpose, acknowledgement. My mother signed it like she was swatting away a fly. My father signed it slowly, the pen trembling between his fingers. By the 6th year, that 1 page had become a binder thick enough that the metal rings complained when I opened it. 11,840 美元. Not enough to buy love, but enough to keep a house standing while everyone inside forgot who was holding it up. I did not buy Hollow Pine Lake, because I was trying to prove anything to my family. That is what people like my mother would never understand. Not everything a daughter builds is a message to the people who failed to see her. Sometimes it is only shelter. Sometimes it is only one locked door in the world that opens because your name is on the key. In the spring of 2022, a hospice billing audit nearly hollowed me out. For 3 months, I sat under fluorescent lights reading charts from elderly patients whose families thought Medicare had covered everything, only to find charges tucked into the wrong places, duplicate claims, little quiet numbers attached to grief. The completion bonus from that audit was the largest check I had ever received. My boss told me to take a trip. Meredith said I should buy something frivolous, something with no practical value at all. So I bought the smallest house I could afford by the water. It was 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, with cedar siding that had weathered silver and a green metal roof that sang when it rained. The dock leaned slightly to the left, the kitchen cabinets stuck in July. The refrigerator hummed like an old man clearing his throat. It was 42 minutes from my apartment and far enough from my mother's voice that my shoulders dropped the second I turned onto the gravel road. The realtor asked if anyone else would be on the deed. "Just me," I said. She looked up from the paperwork, maybe surprised by how quickly I answered. I signed my full name anyway, slowly enough to feel every letter. Clara May Renfield. One signature, one key. One place where nobody could slide a bill across the table and call it family. The first night, I slept on an air mattress in the living room because I had no furniture yet. The lake was black beyond the window. The house creaked in ways I didn't know how to read. I should have felt lonely. Instead, I felt something stranger. Unclaimed. Not unwanted. Not forgotten. Just unclaimed by anybody else's emergency. That first summer, I invited my parents for a weekend because love is complicated, and even tired daughters still want to give their fathers a quiet chair by the water. Leonard sat on the porch with a blanket over his knees and watched the lake until sunset. My mother said the evening light made the whole place look expensive. I laughed because I thought she meant beautiful. By the second summer, she was calling it our little lake place. By Labor Day, it had become the family cottage. At church, she told Pastor Elaine, "We're lucky to have a place by the water now." I never corrected her. Correcting my mother in public was a skill I had been trained out of before I was old enough to understand training. I told myself words were only words. I know better now. Before people take a house, they usually take the story first. That is why the baptism felt wrong before my mother even stood up. It was June of 2025, in the fellowship hall behind Street. Marks, the kind of room every church in Michigan seems to have. Beige folding walls, round tables covered in plastic cloths, a coffee urn that had been burning since morning, and children running between adults who kept saying, "Careful," without meaning it. Haley's second baby, Noah, had slept through the entire ceremony in a white blanket trimmed with blue thread. Everyone called him an angel. My sister looked tired and radiant in the way new mothers do, when the room is full of people willing to call exhaustion beautiful. I was happy for her. I want that understood. There was a sealed-off place inside me where I could love Haley without touching the rest of what our family had made of us. My mother moved through that room like she had planned the lighting herself. Navy dress, silver cross pin. One hand on Haley's shoulder every time someone said how blessed she was. Leonard stood beside the dessert table, holding a manila envelope against his chest. I saw it before I understood it. County envelopes have a certain stiffness. They look ordinary, until you have spent years being afraid of them. After Pastor Elaine finished the prayer, my mother tapped her spoon against a glass. The room softened around her. It always did. Marlene Renfield knew how to gather attention without looking hungry for it. "Leonard and I wanted to do something lasting," she said. "Young families need roots." Haley looked up. Travis straightened. My father did not look at me. Then my mother smiled, wide and holy, and announced that she and Dad had signed the house over to Haley and Travis. "The family home," she said. "Free and clear. A place for the children to grow up. A blessing." The room clapped. Pastor Elaine put both hands over her heart. Uncle Graham said, "That's how family takes care of family." Travis kissed Haley's temple like someone had just handed him a future he had earned. I sat 3 tables back with a plastic cup of punch, warming between my hands, and did the math because numbers were safer than screaming. A $312,000 house. $118,640 I had paid to keep it standing. 6 years of signatures. 0 mentions of my name. My mother looked at me then, not apologetic, not ashamed. Expectant. As if my role in the moment was to clap prettily for the gift I had helped make possible. So I clapped. Under the table, my other hand closed so tight that later, in the church parking lot, I found 4 red crescents pressed into my palm. I made it all the way to my car before my face changed. That is one of the strange skills you learn in a family like mine. You can hold a smile through a prayer, a cake cutting, a public erasure, and 3 older women telling your mother what a beautiful thing she has done. You can hug your sister with your palm still aching. You can tell a baby he looks precious and mean it, because none of this is his fault. Then you close the car door, and the body tells the truth. I sat in the church parking lot with both hands on the steering wheel until the last guests began drifting toward their cars. Through the windshield, I could see my mother near the entrance, accepting compliments like flowers. My father stood 2 steps behind her, still holding the envelope, his shoulders rounded in that familiar way that made people feel sorry for him and never ask what he had allowed. He knew. That was the part I could not keep setting aside. My mother could rearrange a story until even the furniture believed her, but my father knew. He had signed the ledger. He had watched me write checks. He had called me from a hospital parking lot when the house was sliding toward county sale. And when Marlene handed that house to Haley in front of half the church, he did not look at me. I drove home without turning on the radio. My apartment was dark when I got there, the quiet kind of dark that does not comfort you, only waits. I kicked off my shoes by the door and went straight to the little office off the hallway. The gray binder was in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, behind tax folders and old client contracts. I had not touched it since April. I set it on the floor and sat down beside it, still in my church dress. The label on the spine looked almost embarrassingly neat. WREN Fieldhouse Tax, Insurance, Reimbursement. As if neatness could make betrayal easier to hold. I opened the rings, and the pages settled with that soft, final sound paper makes when it has been waiting. Receipts. Notices. Copies of checks. Bank confirmations. 6 ledger pages with my parents' signatures at the bottom. Leonard's careful and uneven. Marlene's sharp and annoyed, like even her handwriting resented being asked to admit anything. I did not feel powerful looking at it. I felt foolish. Not because I had helped them. I do not regret keeping my father warm and insured after surgery. I regret how quietly I did it. I had made my help so clean, so private, so easy to accept, that they had mistaken my silence for absence. Near the back of the binder, tucked in a plastic sleeve, was a note I had printed from a voicemail transcript in 2020. My father's words. Short, awkward, more honest than he usually allowed himself to be. I don't know how to thank you, honey. Your mother doesn't like talking about money, but I know what you're doing. I read it twice. Then I turned my phone face down on the carpet and let the room be silent. I did not call my mother. I did not text Haley. I did not send a screenshot to the family group chat, although my thumb hovered over the folder more than once. There are moments when rage wants an audience, and there are moments when grief wants a witness. That night, I gave neither one what it wanted. I closed the binder. But I did not put it back in the bottom drawer. I placed it on the lower shelf beside my desk, where I could reach it without kneeling. And before I went to bed, I opened my banking app and canceled the next automatic payment connected to a house my family had just given away without saying my name. For 2 months after the baptism, my mother did not mention the house. That was how I knew she was preparing something. Marlene Renfield was never quiet because she was finished. She was quiet because she was arranging the room before anyone else knew there would be a meeting. When she finally called, it was a Tuesday evening, just after 6. I was at my desk, reviewing a claim where a clinic had billed the same wheelchair evaluation twice. My phone lit up with her name, and I let it ring 3 times before I answered. Not because I was busy, because I wanted 3 seconds of choosing. Her voice was warm. Too warm. Your father and I have been talking, she said. Haley's house is full now with the children, and your father needs quiet. The lake air would be good for his heart. I looked at the gray binder on the lower shelf beside my desk. She kept going. Hollow Pine had fewer stairs. It was closer to the cardiology office than people realized. I was hardly there during the week. I lived alone. I had options. Every sentence was wrapped in concern, and every sentence stepped over the same fact. She was asking for my house, as if it were an unused room in hers. I'll think about it, I said. There was a pause. Small, sharp. The sound of a woman who had reached for yes and touched a locked door instead. Think about what, Clara? She asked softly. You're the practical one. 3 days later, I drove to Hollow Pine ahead of a storm. The sky was low and gray, the lake already rough at the edges. I turned onto the gravel road and saw Travis's black truck blocking the drive. My mother's minivan was open at the back. Boxes sat on my porch. Mom meds, dad sweaters, kitchen lake. Travis was at the gate with a screwdriver, working at the old latch, like he had every right to improve what was not his. Haley stood near the steps, with a diaper bag on one shoulder, looking embarrassed but not surprised. My father sat in the passenger seat of the minivan, staring straight ahead. And my mother was on my porch, pressing a strip of blue painter's tape onto the bedroom door. Marlene. Leonard. That was the thing that made my hands go cold. Not the boxes. Not Travis at the gate. The label. My mother had named a room before I had given permission. "What are you doing?" I asked. Travis turned first. He looked annoyed, as if I had arrived early to my own house. "Getting your folks settled," he said. "A house sitting empty is selfish when family has nowhere decent to go." The old yes rose in me. Automatic. Ancient. Then I looked at the key in my hand. A key is not a feeling. A deed is not a suggestion. "No," I said, quietly. Once. Like closing a file. For a second, nobody moved. Even the lake seemed to hold still behind them, gray and restless under the storm clouds. Travis let the screwdriver hang at his side. Haley shifted the diaper bag higher on her shoulder. My father turned his face slightly toward the window, but did not get out of the van. My mother looked at me. Not shocked. Not wounded. Measuring. "You're saying no to your father?" she asked. And there it was, the little door she always opened when the front one would not work. Not no to her. Not no to Travis. No to my father's heart. No to an old man who needed peace. No to the version of myself she had spent 33 years training me to protect. "I'm saying no to anyone moving into my house without permission," I said. The distinction mattered to me. It did not matter to her. The first rain hit the porch roof, soft at first, like fingertips. My mother reached up and smoothed the edge of the blue tape on the bedroom door, as if it were still going to stay there. Then, she peeled it off slowly, folded it once, and slipped it into her purse. That frightened me more than if she had shouted. Marlene Renfield did not waste props. If she kept something, it meant she planned to use it later. "We should go before the roads get bad," she said. No one argued. Travis carried the boxes back to the van with his jaw tight. Haley would not look at me. My father finally opened his door, but only to move one small bag from the porch to the back seat. He passed close enough that I could smell his aftershave and rain on his jacket. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For what?" I asked. He did not answer. That was answer enough. They drove away in a slow line, tires grinding over wet gravel. I stood on my own porch until their taillights disappeared between the pines. Inside, the house felt altered, as if their labels had left fingerprints. I checked the doors twice. I took the blue tape residue off the bedroom door with my thumbnail. Then I sat at the kitchen table and listened to the storm move across the lake. I thought the worst part was over. The next morning, Deputy Kells knocked on my apartment door. My mother had gone to the sheriff's office early, before church, before breakfast, before I had even finished my coffee. She told them I was refusing safe housing to my recovering father. She said Hollow Pine was a family-funded residence. She said I was withholding financial records connected to his care. That last part was not an accident. My mother knew exactly where to press. My work was records. My reputation was records. For years, clinics trusted me because I could walk into a mess of numbers and leave the truth cleaner than I found it. And now my own mother had put my name beside the kind of words that make people lower their voices. Withholding, elderly parent, financial records. The phrase was so backwards I almost admired the construction of it. I had kept my parents housed, insured, repaired, and protected from their own silence. Now she had found a way to describe me as the danger. But that is what happens when you stay quiet too long. People start believing your silence is a blank page they can write on. By noon, Haley called me. I almost did not answer. Her name on my screen still carried the church basement with it, the blue blanket, the applause, Travis standing taller beside a house he had not paid for. But Haley never called in the middle of the day, unless someone else had scared her into it, so I picked up. Her voice was thin and fast. "Mom is planning a family care meeting." Of course she was. In my family, a meeting was never a conversation. It was a room my mother arranged until the truth had nowhere comfortable to sit. Haley said it would be at Hollow Pine on Saturday, because, according to Mom, everyone needed to see the place in question. Pastor Elaine was coming. Uncle Graham. Travis. Dad. Deputy Kells had been asked to stop by as a welfare follow-up, which meant my mother wanted a badge in the audience. "She says you need to explain yourself," Haley whispered. I looked at the gray binder on my shelf. "No," I said. "I don't." That evening, I met Meredith Cho at a diner off Route 131, the one with cracked red booths and coffee that tasted like it had survived 3 shifts. Meredith had been an elder law paralegal for 16 years, and she had the calm, tired eyes of a woman who had watched too many families turn care into leverage. I brought the binder in a canvas tote. She did not touch it right away. She let me put it on the table between the napkin holder and the sugar packets, then she opened it slowly, page by page. When she finished, she sat back. "Do not argue," she said. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "I mean it," she said. "Your mother wins arguments because she does not need them to be true. She only needs them to be emotional. You cannot beat that with a better speech. So what do I do?" Meredith tapped the top page. "You let the record speak before she can turn your voice into attitude." We made folders. One for Pastor Elaine, one for Uncle Graham, one for Haley, one for Deputy Kells, one for my father, deed, closing statement, tax receipts, insurance records, ledger pages, bank confirmations, a summary sheet on top with no adjectives, only dates and amounts. I left my father's voicemail transcript out. That one still felt like a bruise, not evidence. The next morning, just as I was leaving, Dad called. "Please don't make your mother look cruel in front of Pastor Elaine," he said. I stood in my doorway with my keys in my hand and felt something in me finally stop reaching. "Dad," I asked, "if you know I'm telling the truth, why are you letting her do this?" For a long time, all I heard was his kitchen clock. Then he said, "Because it's easier to let you be practical than to make her be fair." I closed my eyes. There it was. The whole family history, balanced in one cowardly sentence. I drove to Hollow Pine that Saturday with the folders stacked in a canvas tote on the passenger seat and my father's sentence sitting beside them like something alive. Because it's easier to let you be practical than to make her be fair. The road north was bright after 2 days of rain. Water still stood in the ditches. The pines along the last mile looked washed clean, almost innocent, which felt insulting considering what was waiting at the end of the gravel drive. When I turned in, there were already too many cars. My mother had not just called a meeting. She had staged one. Her minivan was parked near the porch. Travis's truck sat crooked by the dock like it belonged there. Uncle Graham's Buick was pulled close to the grass. Pastor Elaine's silver sedan was tucked beneath the maple. And near the far edge of the drive, half in shade, was Deputy Kells's cruiser. My stomach tightened when I saw it, but not the way my mother would have wanted. I was not afraid of the badge anymore. I was afraid of how badly she still believed the badge belonged to her story. The patio chairs had been moved into a wide half-circle facing one empty chair. Mine. That was how Marlene Renfield loved a family meeting. She never called it a trial, but she always arranged the furniture like one. Everyone else got to sit together. The person who had disappointed her got the open space, the staring faces, the feeling of being examined under family lighting. I did not sit down. That was the first thing I took back. My mother stood near the center of the patio in cream slacks and a pale blue sweater, dressed soft for the role she meant to play. Pastor Elaine sat with her hands folded over a small Bible on her lap. Uncle Graham leaned against the railing, already frowning, like he had been briefed before the facts arrived. Haley stood near the steps, holding Noah against her shoulder. Travis hovered by the dock, arms crossed, looking at my property with the expression of a man still waiting for the world to correct itself in his favor. My father sat at the far end of the porch. He did not look at me. Marlene began before I had set the tote down. She talked about my father's heart, his need for rest, his age, the stairs in Haley's house, the burden of retirement. She talked about me too, but not to me. That was one of her gifts. She could describe you in front of your own face until you started feeling like a rumor. She said I had always been difficult with money, too clinical, too cold. She said I kept records because I did not trust family. She said Hollow Pines sat empty most weekdays while my father needed a peaceful place to recover. She said I was choosing pride over care. Pastor Elaine looked at me then, not cruelly, but sadly. That almost hurt worse. Uncle Graham shook his head. Your mother shouldn't have to beg. Travis added, a house like this shouldn't sit empty when family needs it. There it was again, the sentence in a cleaner shirt. My mother turned toward me last, softening her voice for the audience. Clara, she said, you're the practical one. You don't need this place the way your father does. The lake moved behind her, quiet and gray. For 33 years, that sentence would have worked. It would have found the old switch inside me. The one labeled be useful, be easy, don't make this harder. I felt it reach for me. Then I looked at the empty chair, and I left it empty. I set the canvas tote on the patio table, unzipped it, and took out the folders. No speech first. No trembling explanation. No apology for the space I was taking up. My mother had given the room 10 minutes of feeling. I gave it paper. I'm not going to argue with you, I said. My voice was quiet enough that everyone had to lean in. That was not an accident. My mother understood volume. She had built a life with it. I wanted the opposite. I'm going to show you the record. I handed the first folder to Pastor Elaine, the second to Uncle Graham, the third to Haley, whose hand tightened around the baby blanket before she took it. The fourth went to Deputy Kells. The fifth I gave to my father. I did not give one to my mother. Not yet. For once, she would have to watch other people read a story she had not edited. The only sound for a while was paper. Pastor Elaine opened hers carefully, like it might hurt someone. Uncle Graham flipped too fast at first, then slower when the numbers began to land. Haley stared at the summary page. Her face changed before she reached the second document. The deed to Hollow Pine was first. One name. Mine. The closing statement followed. Then the tax records, the insurance policy, the repairs, the bank confirmations. After that came the ledger for my parents' house, year by year, each page signed at the bottom by Leonard and Marlene Renfield. At the top of the summary sheet was one sentence Meredith had helped me write because plain truth is harder to twist. Between November 2019 and May 2025, Clara Renfield paid $118,640 toward the preservation of 1846 Alder Street, later transferred to Haley Bellamy without notice. The lake wind moved through the trees. Nobody spoke. Deputy Kells read longer than anyone else. Then he closed the folder halfway and looked at my mother. Mrs. Renfield, he said, polite but flat. This property appears to be solely owned by your daughter. There is nothing here that supports a criminal complaint. And based on these documents, if there is a financial claim, it appears Clara may be a creditor, not an abuser. That was when my mother's face changed. Not sadness, exposure. You kept receipts on your own parents? She snapped. I looked at her then. No, I said. I kept receipts because every time I gave quietly, you called it nothing. Haley covered her mouth. My father looked down at his folder like it had become too heavy to hold. And I gave my mother the sentence I had carried all week. You gave Haley a house. You gave me 6 years of receipts you hoped I'd be too loyal to count. For a moment after I said it, nobody moved. Even my mother seemed to lose the next line she had planned. The wind came off the lake and lifted the corner of Pastor Elaine's folder, and she pressed it down gently, like the paper deserved more care than the story that had brought her there. Haley was the first to speak. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice small. "For the house?" I looked at my sister then, really looked at her. Tired eyes, baby on her hip. A life built inside a version of the truth she had never had to question. I could have scared her. Part of me wanted to. Not because I hated her, but because I wanted, for 1 minute, for somebody else to feel the floor disappear. "But I am not my mother. I'm not taking your house," I said. "I don't want your walls, Haley. I want everyone to stop pretending I didn't hold them up." Travis looked away first. That was its own apology, though not one I intended to accept. I reached back into the tote and took out the last document. 3 pages, plain language, no drama. I had learned by then that in my family, kindness without paper evaporated by morning. The first condition was that my mother would withdraw the complaint and send a written correction to the sheriff's office, stating that Hollow Pine was not family property. The second was that my parents, Haley and Travis, would acknowledge I had no financial obligation to the house on Alder Street going forward. The third was simple. If anyone tried to move into Hollow Pine, rename it, claim it, or pressure me through another public performance, I would file the ledger as a formal lien against the transferred house. My father signed first. His hand shook so badly the pen scratched the page. Then he looked up at me with eyes I had waited 33 years to see clearly. "I'm sorry," he said. "I let you be strong because it was easier than being honest." Haley signed next. She whispered, "I didn't know." "I know," I said. "But not knowing helped you. It cost me." My mother signed last. Her face was hard, but her hand was not steady. "I didn't know you were keeping score," she said. I folded the signed pages and placed them back in the folder. "I wasn't keeping score, Mom," I said. "I was keeping myself from disappearing. I kept Hollow Pine. I did not take Haley's house. I stopped paying for silence." Later, I helped my father look at senior apartments near his cardiologist as a daughter, not a bank. That night, I drove back to the lake alone. The blue tape residue was still faint on the bedroom door. I cleaned it off with my thumbnail, opened the window, and let the cold air in. The house was quiet, not empty. Quiet. There is a difference. The lesson Clara learned was not that family is dangerous, or that love should always come with paperwork. That would be too simple. The real lesson was quieter than that. Sometimes the people who depend on you the most are the same people who forget you are carrying weight. Not because your pain is invisible, but because you have made it so easy for them not to look. Being dependable is a beautiful thing. Being generous is a beautiful thing. Helping your parents, your siblings, your children, or the people you love can be one of the most meaningful parts of life. But love becomes unhealthy when it only flows in one direction. A family should never ask one person to be the foundation while everyone else gets to call the house theirs. Clara did not lose her heart when she kept receipts. She found her backbone. She learned that boundaries are not cruelty. Saying no is not betrayal. Protecting what you built is not selfish. Sometimes it is the first honest thing you have done for yourself in years. The deepest pain in this story was not the money. It was being erased. It was watching other people receive praise for a sacrifice she made in silence. It was realizing that being called the practical one had become another way of saying, "You can handle being hurt." But Clara's strength came from the moment she stopped begging to be understood and started standing on the truth. She did not destroy her family. She did not take revenge. She simply refused to disappear. And maybe that is the lesson many of us need. You can love people and still lock your door. You can forgive people and still keep records. You can help your family and still refuse to be used by them. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, or if you have ever been the one everyone leaned on but no one thanked, leave a comment below. I want to hear your story. And if Clara's courage touched you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the next story. Because quiet people deserve to be heard too.